I'll tell you what I know about signal noise. Every relay station in the drift corridor runs a quantum signature feed, a constant low-level broadcast that goes out to the nearest beacon cluster, picks up environmental scatter, and comes back. The returning signal is supposed to be flat, near zero variance. The galactic standard is a tolerance of plus or minus 3 microhertz across the entire harmonic band, and if your station is calibrated correctly, you never see anything outside that range. You file your nightly maintenance log. You drink whatever passes for coffee on whichever rig you happen to be stationed on, and you wait for 600 when the day crew comes in smelling of actual sleep. I had been doing that job for 6 years on Vaethari station. I was good at it, not inspired good. The kind of good that comes from doing something carefully and without fuss for long enough that you stop needing to think about most of it. My supervisor, a broad-shouldered Ketharn named Davis Rel, once told me that I was the most methodical human he had ever met, and he said it the way you might say someone has very regular teeth. A neutral observation. Not a compliment, not a criticism, just a fact he had noticed. I took it as a compliment anyway. The night I found the signal was the 342nd night in a row I had worked the 2200 to 600 maintenance shift on Vaethari station, Drift Corridor 11. I know the number because I had been counting. Not obsessively, just the way you count after a while, when the days are long and the nights are longer, and the universe outside your porthole is a very consistent shade of dark. 342 nights since I had transferred in from the Calvin Survey office, where I had spent 11 years as a cartographic systems analyst before the office was quietly dissolved in the third round of galactic budget restructuring. 342 nights since I had taken the only work available for a man with my very specialized, very suddenly obsolete skill set. Cartographic systems analysis is, at its core, the discipline of reading patterns in data that other instruments have already recorded and decided are unimportant. You take the background scatter from a long-range survey sweep, the noise, the stuff that falls outside the parameters the survey was actually looking for, and you go through it by hand, methodically, because sometimes the noise is not noise. Sometimes the noise is the thing the survey parameters were written too narrowly to catch. I had found 4 new transit corridors that way, not major ones, not the kind of corridors that make a career or attract ceremony, but real corridors, real routes documented and filed and eventually absorbed into the navigational charts under the names the route filing office assigned them, not mine. I had not minded that either. The point was finding them. The point was reading the pattern correctly. The thing itself was the thing, not the credit for it. I want to explain something about that because it is relevant to what follows. There is a type of person, common enough that the cartographic office had a word for them, though the word was not flattering, who reads patterns in the data looking for what they want to find, who has a conclusion ahead of the search. The 4 corridors I found were not found that way. I found them by going through background scatter that no one had asked me to look at, and applying the same scrutiny I applied to everything, without knowing in advance what I was looking for. 2 of the 4 came back as nothing, months of careful reading that resolved into genuine random variance. That is the other half of the work. You sit with the noise patiently enough, and you find real signals, and you also find the things that looked like signals and turned out not to be, and you document those findings the same way. The methodology does not change based on what you find at the end of it. I had brought that methodology to the relay maintenance work without being asked, and without entirely meaning to. It was not useful for the job in the way the manual defined useful. Davis Rel had never once asked me to analyze the raw harmonic return feed, but I had a secondary monitor setup and 6 hours a night, and the kind of mind that cannot stop looking at a feed once it knows the feed is running. So I looked, every night. Methodically, without expectation, the way you sit with a long survey sweep and let the data speak for itself rather than speaking for it. 6 years of relay maintenance had not entirely killed that habit. The maintenance console at vaethari was not a cartographic instrument, but it ran feeds, and feeds produce data, and data contains patterns, and I had 6 hours every night in which there was very little else to do. So I had built myself a second monitor setup on the secondary console, the one technically reserved for backup system checks, and I piped the raw harmonic return feed through it alongside the processed output the primary console displayed. The processed output was what I was paid to read. The raw feed was something else. Something I did for the same reason I had done the cartographic work, because the pattern was there, and patterns do not care whether you are being paid to read them. So, the night I found it, I was running a routine check on the harmonic return feed at approximately 217. The feed had been slightly noisier than usual for about a week, not outside tolerance, not enough to flag, just slightly elevated variance in a narrow band near the lower end of the spectrum. Davis Rel had glanced at it on the handoff report and written environmental scatter, corridor 11 expansion zone in the margin, which was a reasonable assessment. There had been a lot of traffic in the expansion zone that month. Traffic produces scatter. Scatter elevates variance. Standard operational physics. Except, the elevated variance was not random. I had been looking at it passively for 7 days, and on the 8th day, sitting in the maintenance bay with my coffee going cold beside me, I realized that the variance had a shape, not a complicated shape. Not a shape that would have jumped out at anyone running a standard deviation check against the tolerance thresholds. But I had spent 11 years reading cartographic scatter, and scatter that has a shape is not scatter. Scatter is random by definition. If the variance has a shape, the variance is a signal. I pulled the raw data feed, not the processed output, the raw integers. The numbers the station's harmonic processor had already run through its standard filter and decided were environmental noise and therefore irrelevant. I pulled them up on my secondary console and I looked at them, not with any particular urgency. I looked at them the way I looked at everything, steadily, patiently, without having already decided what I was going to find. The shape repeated every 41 seconds, exact. Not approximately 41 seconds, not 41 seconds plus or minus a drift factor, exactly 41 seconds, to the precision limit of the station's internal chronometer, which was, for the record, 4 decimal places. A natural signal does not repeat at exactly 41 seconds. An interference pattern does not repeat at exactly 41 seconds. A feedback loop does not repeat at exactly 41 seconds. Feedback loops drift. The only things that repeat at exact intervals are things that are coded to repeat at exact intervals, or things whose repeatability is a function of some underlying rhythm that is itself exact. Nothing in Drift Corridor 11's expansion zone was transmitting on that frequency at that interval. I checked the traffic logs. I checked the beacon schedule. I checked the maintenance records for every piece of our own equipment that might conceivably have generated a feedback loop. I cross-referenced the known transmission formats of every registered species and regulatory body that operated in Corridor 11, which took 40 minutes and which I did without skipping any entries, because that is what thoroughness requires. Nothing. I sat with it for a while, drank my cold coffee. Looked at the shape on the screen. The shape was not a communications protocol I recognized. It was not a navigational beacon format. It was not a distress signal or a proximity warning or any of the other standard galactic broadcast formats I had been required to learn when I first took the maintenance certification. It was something older than all of those, or different from all of those, and the way it repeated, regular, precise, patient, like a heartbeat that had been beating in the dark for a very long time without anyone listening, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the maintenance bay. I ran it through the station's general identification library first. No match. The library returned the standard no result notification in the flat, affectless font of automated systems that are not designed to register the significance of what they are failing to find. Then I ran it through the extended identification library, which took longer to access because the station's processing allocation did not prioritize it during night shift operations. It required me to manually authorize the query and wait for the system to redirect bandwidth from 3 non-critical subsystems. The redirect itself took 11 minutes. I sat and watched the progress indicator move and drank the rest of my cold coffee. Davis Rel would note the unauthorized reallocation in my log. I made a note to explain it in the morning. I was not particularly worried about it. The extended library returned a match at 2:49. I read the result 3 times. Then I sat very still for approximately 4 minutes, which is not something I do often. I am not a person who sits very still. I am a person who, when presented with a result, reads the result and takes the next indicated step. The 4 minutes of very stillness were, I think, the time it took my brain to finish reading what my eyes had already seen and arrive at the conclusion those words required. The signal was a passive quantum signature emitter, biological in origin, not a device, not a broadcast, not anything transmitted deliberately in the conventional sense. A quantum signature emitter is something a body does, not something it chooses to do. Every vaethari of the imperial bloodline carries one, encoded in the resonance structure of their cellular matrix at the genetic level. It is, as the library's explanation put it, the biological equivalent of a royal seal, an identity marker that the vaethari bloodlines had carried for so long it had become physiological rather than ceremonial. The emitter produces a continuous, low-level quantum harmonic at a unique frequency tied to the individual carrier's specific bloodline signature. It cannot be turned off. It cannot be masked, not completely, not by any technology the Galactic Registry had on record. It passes through most standard shielding materials the way a radio wave passes through walls, attenuated, diminished, but present. And it repeats, because biological rhythms repeat, at a rate tied to the individual's own cellular resonance cycle. 41 seconds. The signal had been bleeding through vaethari Station's environmental shielding for, the extended library estimate suggested, somewhere between 8 and 12 years, leaking into the harmonic return feed as a few extra microhertz of variance in a narrow band that the station's standard filter had been reliably classifying as environmental noise every single night for 8 to 12 years. Every maintenance tech who had worked nights on the station during that time, there had been, by my rough count, at least a dozen of them before me, had looked at the processed output of that feed and seen flat readings inside tolerance. Because the standard filter was doing what it was designed to do, which was to classify low-level variance as environmental scatter and remove it from the output. I thought about that for a moment. 8 to 12 years of a royal bloodline signature bleeding silently into the maintenance feed of a deep space relay station, and every system, and every human, and every non-human crew member who had run the overnight check had looked at it and seen nothing but noise. I pulled the bloodline reference from the extended library. The vaethari imperial line, specifically the secondary imperial line, the one that had branched from the primary throne succession 4 generations back and been given governance of the outer drift territories. The library entry was short, which is how you know an entry has been edited. Long entries have weight to them, generations of footnotes, administrative records, survey reports, the sedimentary accumulation of a bloodline that has existed for a long time and been noticed. Short entries are recent. Short entries mean someone decided to stop adding to the record, and the gap between when the adding stopped and the present is a shape in itself, if you know how to read it. This one read as follows: vaethari secondary line outer drift territories, status, extinct, last confirmed holder, record SCALED. Extinction confirmed by Imperial Registry Census, Year 3 of the reformulation. No active emitters on record. Year 3 of the reformulation was 11 years ago. I knew what the reformulation was. Everyone knew what the reformulation was, in the same way everyone knows about a storm that happened the year before they arrived, not personally, not viscerally, but factually. The vaethari primary throne had consolidated power. Consolidated was the polite word. What had actually happened, in the less polite version available in the historical access files, was that the primary line had moved against the secondary and tertiary branches of the imperial family, the branches that governed the outer drift territories, and had stripped them of their holdings, their registry standing, their bloodline records. Some had been sent to administrative exile in the outer systems. Some had simply stopped appearing in the records. The secondary line had been listed as extinct in the census. No survivors confirmed. Record sealed. The entry in the library was short because someone with registry access and a sufficiently senior clearance had gone in and made it short, and the brevity itself was a kind of statement. Except there was a biological quantum signature emitter producing a harmonic at exactly 41 seconds in the maintenance feed of vaethari Station, Drift Corridor 11, and it had been doing so for 8 to 12 years, and it was not coming from any piece of our equipment. It was coming from somewhere inside the station. I want to be precise about what I did next and what I did not do. I did not, at any point in the following hour, tell myself a story about what was happening. I have learned from 11 years of reading signals that other people had already decided were noise, that the moment you start telling yourself a story about a pattern, the moment you decide what it means before you have finished reading it, you have stopped reading it. You are reading your own story instead, and those two things are not the same. I have read my own story before, in the early years of the cartographic work, and I have ended up looking for corridors in parts of space where the background data suggested a corridor I wanted to find rather than a corridor that was actually there. I made that mistake twice. I did not make it a third time. So I did not tell myself a story. I simply followed the signal. The quantum signature emitter's harmonic was bleeding into the environmental feed through the station's structural shielding. The shielding is not uniform. It has thicker and thinner points, determined by the station's construction geometry and the age of the individual panels. I pulled the station's structural schematics from the archive. They were in the maintenance system, where I had access, and I identified the 3 sections of shielding that were thin enough and close enough to the harmonic feeds collection array to allow the kind of bleed I was seeing. The calculation took 20 minutes. I did it twice to confirm the geometry. 2 of those 3 sections were in cargo storage areas that had been sealed since a consignment dispute 8 months ago. I pulled the access logs. Neither had been opened since the seal date. No one had been in either of those sections in 8 months. The signal predated the seal. The third was Corridor 11 Gamma, the residential and working quarters section. Specifically, the section closest to the data calibration laboratory, where the afternoon shift typically ended their work at 1800, and where, occasionally, the more dedicated members of the calibration team stayed past their official hours to complete long-running processes. I filed a preliminary anomaly report at 3:11, not to Davis Rel, who was asleep, but to the station's automated maintenance log, which would sit unread in the system queue until the morning supervisor reviewed the overnight filings. I noted the signal characteristics, the source triangulation, and the library match. I classified it as a Priority 2 maintenance query, which means it requires follow-up but not immediate escalation. Then I sat for another few minutes and thought about what I was actually going to do. The reasonable thing, the thing a reasonable maintenance technician does when they find an anomaly, is file the report and let the day crew follow up. That is the procedure. That is what the manual says. The manual does not say, Go to the data calibration laboratory at 3:20 in the morning and speak to the person whose bloodline signature you just found in the maintenance feed. I thought about the 8 to 12 years. I thought about the short library entry and the gap where the record should have continued and had not. I thought about what it would mean for a person who had been carrying a signal like that, who had been careful for 8 to 12 years not to let anyone find them, to come into work on an ordinary morning and find an escalated report waiting in the station commander's queue about a bloodline match to an extinct imperial line, cross-referenced with their duty assignment. I thought about the difference between a system finding something and a person finding something, and whether that difference mattered, and I thought that it did. I went to the data calibration laboratory. It was 3:24. I want to say I knew, the way people in stories know things with certainty, with drama, with a sense of fate settling into place. But it was not like that. It was quieter than that. I went because I had followed the signal to its source, and in 11 years of reading patterns I had learned that when the signal leads somewhere, you go there. You do not send an automated report instead. You go and you look with your own eyes. The laboratory was lit with the dim blue worklight setting that the station uses during off hours, enough to see by, not enough to be comfortable in for long. She was there, Soverath Den. I knew her the way I knew most of the station's crew, by face, by shift rotation, by the kind of brief corridor acknowledgments that accumulate over months into a rough sense of a person without quite constituting friendship. She was one of 6 data calibration technicians on vaethari. She was good at her work, methodical, which I recognized and respected from the quality of the calibration records I occasionally cross-referenced in my own maintenance checks. She had been on the station for 3 years, which meant she had preceded me by 3 years. She was seated at her primary calibration console, which was unusual. The data calibration team's standard hours were 600 to 1800, and it was 3:24. She was not working. She was simply sitting, with her hands flat on the console surface and her eyes on the screen in front of her, which was dark. The laboratory's environmental system hummed. Somewhere deeper in the station, the relay equipment cycled through its overnight sequence with a sound like a slow breath. I had not made noise coming in. She heard me anyway. She turned her head before I reached the middle of the room, and her eyes, large, very dark, the kind of dark that catches light and holds it rather than reflecting it outward, found me with the immediate precision of someone who had spent a long time listening carefully to every space they occupied. Soverath Den was not tall. She was slight, with the slim-framed build that most vaethari carry, the kind that reads as fragile from a distance and is not. Her skin, in the blue worklight, was the pale slate blue of deep water above a dark continental shelf, and she wore her hair deep teal with silver threading through it where it had grown out from whatever treatment she used to dull its natural color, cut close to her skull in the functional, unremarkable style common to half the station's technical staff. She had a calibration technician's badge on her uniform and a calibration technician's posture, and in every respect that the station systems and social protocols cared about, she was exactly what her file said she was. She had been passing. She had been passing for years, and she was very good at it, and the expression on her face when she saw me holding the console datapad with my preliminary report open on, it was the expression of someone who has been very carefully not running for a very long time, and has just heard, at 3:24, something that could be the sound of what they were not running from. Not fear. I want to be precise about this. Not the animal flinch of someone caught. Something quieter than that, and heavier and more resigned. The expression of someone setting down a weight they have been carrying so long they had forgotten it had a name. I said, I found a signal in the harmonic return feed. She looked at the datapad in my hand. She looked at my face. She did not say anything. It's been there for a while, I said. Years, probably. The standard filter was reading it as environmental scatter. I paused. I used to be a cartographic analyst. Reading scatter is a habit I haven't been able to break." A very long silence. The blue work light hummed between us. "How long have you known?" she said. "About 3 hours," I said. "I filed a preliminary anomaly report to the maintenance log at 3:11. It's sitting in the queue. The morning supervisor will get to it around 700 if they review the overnights before the shift briefing. Some of them don't always." She absorbed this. Her eyes had not left my face. They were measuring something, not in a hostile way, in the careful way of someone reading a pattern they do not yet fully understand, trying to decide whether the shape of it is what it appears to be. "You came here instead of escalating," she said. "I came here first," I said. "There's a difference." Another silence, longer. "What are you going to do?" she said. I sat down in the nearest chair, the one in front of the secondary calibration terminal, the one that was not hers, and I put the datapad on the console between us. Not toward her, not away from her, on the console equidistant. "I've spent about 3 hours thinking about that," I said. "What I keep coming back to is this. I found a signal that the station systems had been looking at for 8 to 12 years and calling noise. And I think that anyone who has been carrying that signal for 8 to 12 years, in a place where it wasn't safe to be carrying it, and had been careful enough to make it invisible to every standard system on record, I think that person has been carrying something I don't fully understand yet. And I don't think it's my place to decide what happens with it before I understand it." She looked at me for a long time. The blue work light hummed. In the relay bay 2 decks below, I could hear the harmonic feed cycling through its overnight sequence. It occurred to me, sitting there, that the signal I had found was in that feed right now. Had been in it every night I had sat in the maintenance bay and run my checks. She had been 2 corridors away, and the station had been listening to her heartbeat in its sleep for years, without knowing what it was hearing. "The record says extinct," she said at last. It was not a denial. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flatness of someone who has been saying it to themselves for 11 years as a form of protection, not because they believed it, but because believing the alternative was too costly. "The record was edited," I said. "Short entries get edited. I know what an edited entry looks like." I paused. "I spent 11 years reading what was missing from charts. A gap in a record is itself a kind of signal." Something shifted in her face, very small. The kind of shift that is not visible unless you are paying close attention, and I was paying close attention. "You read the entry." "I read everything in the result," I said. "I read the bloodline match, the census note, the seal. I read what a vaethari secondary line quantum signature means, and I read what the secondary line governed." I looked at her directly. "I know what I found." She was quiet again. Then, carefully, "The people who edited that record have access to the galactic registry. If a match result comes back through official channels, they will know within hours. The registry is not discrete. It reports automatically to the Imperial Oversight Bureau, which has not been neutral since the reformulation." "I know," I said. "And you still filed the preliminary report." "I filed a priority 2 maintenance query," I said. "Not a bloodline match. The maintenance query logs the signal anomaly and notes an unidentified biological emitter as the probable source. It does not cross-reference the extended library result. That cross-reference only exists on my secondary console, which is not part of the standard log feed, and which Davis Rel is going to be annoyed about for other reasons entirely." I looked at her. "I told you I filed a preliminary report. I didn't tell you everything that was in it." A silence. She processed this with the methodical care of a calibration technician who does not commit to a reading before all the data is in. Then she said, very quietly, "Why?" I thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was simple, and simple things sometimes feel insufficient to the weight of a question. "Because I found something that the whole system had looked at and called nothing," I said, "and I have a professional disagreement with that assessment." She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. The blue work light caught the surface of her eyes and held there, and what I saw in them was not the calculated evaluation of threat and safety that I had half expected. It was something older than that and more complicated, and I had no convenient word for it. The secondary line governed 17 systems in the outer drift, she said at last. Her voice was even, precise. The voice of someone reporting facts about a place they once lived and have not been permitted to speak of as their own for a long time. 42 million registered citizens at the last census before the reformulation. My mother administered 11 of those systems directly. My father held the seat at the drift conclave. She stopped. The laboratory was very quiet. I was 22, she said. I was finishing my 3rd year of technical training when the reformulation began. My father sent me out on a survey routing ahead of she paused. The word she chose not to say sat in the air between us for a moment. He sent me out so there would be one of us who was not in the capital when they sealed the registry. I have been a data calibration technician since. 11 years. 22 to 33. The age on her station file said 33. Did anyone else get out? I said. I don't know, she said. I have not been able to ask. I let that sit for a moment. I did not say I was sorry, because I am not good at saying that in a way that sounds like anything other than a formula, and she did not seem like someone who needed formulas. What she had said required no response that I could improve by adding sentiment to. She had told me a fact. The fact was that she did not know if anyone else had survived the reformulation with their bloodline intact, and she had not been able to find out. And she had been sitting with that not knowing for 11 years, alongside all the other things she had been sitting with. I am not a person who talks much when I am thinking. I have been told this can read as coldness, but it is not coldness, it is the opposite. When a thing deserves thought, it deserves the actual thought rather than a placeholder response while the thought is still happening. So I said nothing for a moment, and she seemed to understand this, and she waited with the patience of someone who is accustomed to waiting. I picked up the datapad from the console. I looked at the preliminary report, the anodyne technical priority 2 maintenance query that mentioned an unidentified biological emitter and did not mention the extended library result. Then I looked at her. There's a process, I said, for bloodline match results. When a quantum signature emitter identifies against a registry record, there's a formal process for confirmation and documentation. It goes through the station commander, through the sector registry office, through the bureau. Yes, she said, I know the process. The process takes 7 to 12 days, I said, if it's initiated. She waited. I have not initiated it, I said. A silence, careful. You're going to, she said. Not a question, not quite an accusation. The tone of someone reading a pattern they are not certain they are reading correctly, who wants to be accurate. I think that's your decision, I said. Not mine. I found the signal. I know what it is. What happens to that information? I set the datapad on the console again, face down this time, so neither of us needed to look at it. That belongs to you, not to me. Whatever she had been braced for when she heard me come through the door, after 11 years of being careful, 11 years of waiting for a door to open the wrong way, it was not this. I could see that. The stillness that came over her was not the stillness of calculation. It was the stillness of a person who has been carrying weight so long that the sudden, unexpected absence of its pressure is more disorienting than the weight itself. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "You read cartographic data." "For 11 years," I said. "Before the survey office closed." "And after?" "Maintenance tech," I said. "This is my 6th year." She nodded slowly, absorbing this. "You found this in the maintenance feed." "Harmonic return feed," I said. "It runs every night. I've been looking at it for 6 years." "And tonight?" "The variance had a shape," I said. "I noticed I'm methodical." Something happened in her face when I said that. Not a smile, something quieter than a smile, the kind of expression that contains both a kind of warmth and a kind of grief, and holds them together without resolving them into either. The kind of expression that happens when someone hears something true after a long time of not hearing it spoken simply. We sat in the data calibration laboratory while the station breathed around us, and the harmonic feed cycled in the deck below, and the external dark of drift corridor 11 pressed against the porthole glass. I thought about the short library entry. I thought about the word extinct, and the way it had been placed there by someone who had known it was not accurate and had placed it anyway, with the careful confidence of people who believe that a record written in the right place has the power to rewrite the world it describes. I thought about 42 million registered citizens in 17 systems with no representation at the Drift Conclave for 11 years. I thought about a 22-year-old woman sent out ahead of a storm by a father who understood what was coming, carrying an indelible signal in her own biology that no amount of careful living could turn off. At 4:47, she said, "I have thought about this for a long time. I thought about it differently when I was younger. I thought there would be a moment when the situation had resolved, when it was safe, when there was a clear pathway. There never was. There was just the waiting and the being careful and the question of whether the thing still mattered. Whether the outer drift still mattered," I said. "Whether 42 million people who have been administered by the consolidated throne for 11 years, and have not been represented at the Drift Conclave in 11 years, and have had no one speaking to the registry on their behalf in 11 years. She stopped. "Whether they still mattered," I said. "Yes." I thought about that for a moment. The question she was asking was not a simple one, and she was not asking for a simple answer. She had been sitting with this long enough to know that simple answers were available, and none of them were adequate. She was asking whether the effort was worth the risk. She was asking whether, after 11 years, the thing she had been preserving was still worth the cost of preserving it. And she was asking it now, in this laboratory, to a maintenance technician she had known by corridor acknowledgement and reputation for 3 years, which told me that she had thought about it alone for 11 years, and had run out of room to keep thinking about it alone. "I can't answer that," I said. "I'm not qualified to speak to drift governance or conclave representation. I'm a relay maintenance technician." I looked at the porthole. "But I know what the registry result says, and I know that it's accurate. And in cartography, when you find a corridor that the survey declared empty, you don't leave it empty on the chart because the first survey said so. You record what you found. You record it accurately. Whatever the implications are, the accuracy comes first." She looked at me for a long time. "If I initiate the process," she said carefully, "it goes through the station commander. Commander Veth is a competent administrator and a loyal officer of the current Imperial Compact. He will follow the protocol correctly and completely, which means the Imperial Oversight Bureau will have the report within 2 days." "Yes." "The Bureau is controlled by the primary line." "I know. There are people there who will do whatever they can to bury the result a second time," she said. "They've done it before. They have the infrastructure for it, and they have 11 years of practice." "I know," I said, "but the preliminary report in the maintenance log already exists. It's time-stamped and sitting in the queue. Any legal authority with access to the station's maintenance archives can establish the timeline, can establish that the signal was identified and logged before any suppression attempt. The maintenance log is a local station record. It is not part of the Imperial Registry System. The Bureau cannot reach it without a formal audit request, and a formal audit request would generate more attention than the original result." She looked at me steadily. "You thought about this?" "I had 3 hours," I said. "I'm methodical." This time it was a smile, not large, the careful, controlled smile of someone who has not had cause to smile freely in a long time and has not entirely lost the capability. "You keep saying that." It keeps being relevant, I said. She was quiet again. The station's overhead lights shifted slightly, the automated system beginning its pre-dawn gradual brightening cycle, still an hour and a half from full morning light. The laboratory took on a warmer tone. In it, her skin was less the cold slate blue of artificial work light, and more the complex layered color it actually was, deep water and pale slate, and where the warming light caught the angle of her jaw, a faint undertone of something almost silver. She said, "There is a secondary process, not through the station commander. A vaethari bloodline match, if documented by an independent witness with no registered affiliation to either imperial faction, can be submitted directly to the Outer Drift Conclave Secretariat. The conclave was suspended, not dissolved. There is a legal distinction that the primary throne has spent 11 years trying to erase, and has not succeeded in erasing, because the Outer Drift Charter predates the current throne by 400 years. Under the Charter, a suspended conclave retains administrative standing and the right to receive evidentiary submissions. An independent witness submission to the conclave secretariat bypasses the Bureau entirely. It goes to a chamber that the primary throne cannot reach without triggering a charter crisis that they have been trying to avoid for 11 years. She said all of this steadily, from memory, with the precision of someone who has had 11 years to know a procedure they believed they would never use. I absorbed this. Who qualifies as an independent witness? I said. Any registered galactic citizen with no bloodline, contractual, or factional affiliation to any vaethari line, she said, and no registered affiliation to the Imperial Oversight Bureau or the current compact government. I'm a relay maintenance technician, I said. Before that, a cartographic analyst. Before that, a survey assistant on a contracted survey vessel out of the Calvin system. I have no affiliations to anything more complicated than this station's maintenance rotation, and a lapsed membership in the Calvin Survey Workers Guild. I know, she said. A pause. You knew this was an option, I said. I've known for 11 years, she said. I needed an independent witness, a beat. I needed someone who had found the signal on their own without being directed to find it, someone who had read it and understood it and had come to me before they escalated, someone, she paused, choosing the word carefully, someone I could trust with it. The morning light was coming up slowly in the laboratory. The porthole showed the faintest change in the ambient light of Drift Corridor 11, the station's running lights shifting in their overnight cycle, the far-off flicker of the corridor beacon beginning its early warm-up sequence. Outside, the dark of the corridor held its depth, the stars in their positions, the corridor traffic beginning to stir at the edges of my awareness in the form of distant sound from the decks below. 11 years is a long time to wait, I said. I wasn't waiting, she said. I had stopped expecting it. A pause. There's a difference. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the maintenance feed and the signal in it, and the 6 years I had been looking at it and seeing noise, and the 7 nights I had been looking at the shape of the noise before I recognized it for what it was. I thought about the 4 transit corridors I had found in 11 years of reading backgrounds. I thought about what it means to carry something true through a long period in which no instrument is calibrated to read it. I'll be the independent witness, I said. Tell me what the submission requires. The process was not simple. I want to be honest about that. What followed over the next several hours, and then the next several days, was not a clean line from signal to recognition. We sat in that laboratory until 600, going through the procedural requirements for a conclave secretariat submission, which Soverath had memorized with the thoroughness of someone who has had 11 years to do nothing else with a particular piece of knowledge. The submission required a certified quantum signature scan, not the passive identification I had done through the maintenance feed, but an active scan, conducted by a registered station medical officer, with the results documented on a format the conclave recognized. It required a sworn independent witness attestation to be notarized by someone with a galactic registry commission, of which there was one on Vaethari Station, the docking registrar, a meticulous older Theran named Asiv who I had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 6 years, and who had always seemed to me like someone quietly waiting to be useful. And it required her name, her actual name, which was not Soverath Den. When she told me, she watched my face the way she had been watching it since I came through the door, with careful, measured attention, reading the pattern of my reaction. I listened to it completely. The full vaethari name, with the lineage markers and the territorial designation that the reformulation had struck from the registry, and that I was hearing spoken aloud for the first time, that she was saying aloud, I suspected, for the first time in years. "All right," I said. I wrote it down exactly as she had said it. I made sure I had the lineage markers correct. I asked her to confirm the territorial designation twice, because the notation system was unfamiliar to me, and I did not want to enter it incorrectly on the submission. She looked at me with that expression again, the one that was not a smile and was not grief and was both, as I checked the spelling of the third marker against her pronunciation, methodically, the way I check readings I am not certain of. "You're writing it down," she said. "I don't want to get it wrong," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I have said it to myself," she said, "every day for 11 years so I would not forget how it sounds. I have not said it to anyone else." I looked up from the notation. She was looking at the paper where I had written it, not at me. "It's accurate," I said. "I'll make sure the submission uses it exactly." She nodded, once, a small, contained nod, the kind that is doing a great deal of work beneath its surface. I said her name, formally, the full name with the lineage markers and the territorial designation, the way it was meant to be read when it was read officially. I said it the way you say a name when you are reading it back to confirm you have recorded it correctly, which is what I was doing. I did not say it to be ceremonial about it. I said it because that was the next step in the process, and I do not skip steps. She said nothing for a long moment. The morning light was almost fully up now, and the laboratory was warm and the harmonic feed cycled in the deck below. Then she said, very quietly, "You said it correctly." "I checked twice," I said. A silence, then so quietly that I was not certain for a moment I had heard it right. "Thank you." And that was the recognition, not the scan result that Dr. Ferin would run at 7:30, documented on 3 separate formats. Not the sworn attestation that Asiv would prepare in his meticulous, unhurried Theran hand. Not the secretariat confirmation that would come 4 days later, placing the matter under charter review and sending a formal notice to the Imperial Oversight Bureau that the Outer Drift Secondary Lines extinction record was being contested through independent witness protocol. Not the provisional restoration of registry standing that the conclave panel would issue 6 days after that. All of those things happened, and they mattered enormously, in ways that extended far beyond the 2 of us in a laboratory on a relay station in Drift Corridor 11. 42 million citizens in 17 systems, without representation for 11 years. That weight was real and is real, and I do not diminish it. But the recognition happened at 600 in the data calibration laboratory, when I said her name correctly and she said thank you, and neither of us said anything else for a while. Asiv was not, as I had expected, difficult. He was meticulous. He went through the attestation requirements with exactly the thoroughness I would have expected from a Theran who had held a registry commission for 40 years, but he was not an unkind person. When I explained what I was attesting to, and why, he looked at Soverath with the expressionless opacity that Theran use when they are feeling something they have not decided whether to display. Then he said, "The charter submission process. Yes. I know the procedure." A pause, and in the pause he seemed to be weighing something, some consideration that ran deeper than the procedural. "I was at the Drift Conclave when the reformulation began. I had my commission then, the same as I do now. He looked at me. You found this in the maintenance feed. Harmonic return feed, I said. I read cartographic data, old habit. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, I will need 20 minutes to prepare the attestation documents, and he said it with the air of someone who had been waiting for a long time to be asked to prepare something that mattered. He took 23 minutes. They were thorough minutes. I did not mind. Dr. Ferin was annoyed at me in the specific way that medical officers are annoyed when maintenance technicians arrive at their door before the official start of the day shift, and who became very quiet and very focused when I explained what the scan was for. She ran it twice. She documented it on 3 separate formats, including the conclave-recognized one, and she signed all 3 without being asked and without comment, which I respected. Commander Veth received a courtesy notification from me at 900, after the attestation and the scan were already filed with the station's secure archive. The notification was factual and brief. A bloodline match result had been identified in the station's harmonic return feed. It was being submitted through the conclave secretariat process under the Outer Drift Charter, with an independent witness attestation and a certified scan on file. The timestamp from the maintenance log preliminary report established the identification timeline. He called me to his office and asked 6 careful questions and then said, the conclave charter process is legal. The station has no grounds to interfere. He looked at me for a moment. You understand what you're involved in? I found a signal, I said. I read it. He held my eyes for a moment, then noted. The Bureau's formal challenge came 4 days after the submission. It argued procedural irregularities in the scan documentation, a challenge that Asif had anticipated when he prepared the attestation, and that the triple format scan was specifically designed to make untenable. The challenge was written in the flat, self-assured language of an institution that expects compliance, and it arrived with a secondary notice directing vaethari station's commanding officer to preserve all documentation pending a formal registry review. Commander Veth read both documents, acknowledged receipt, and took no action, because the charter submission process was not within his administrative authority to interfere with, and he had the competence to know it. The conclave's charter review panel, a body that had been technically in session for 11 years, meeting quarterly by remote transmission from wherever its individual members happened to be posted, existing in the legal gap between suspended and dissolved, doing the quiet administrative work of waiting for something like this, accepted the documentation, and issued a provisional restoration of registry standing within 6 days of receiving it. The notification came through on a morning when I was not on shift, and Soverath sent a message to my personal comm that said only, "Provisional restoration confirmed, hearing in 3 months." I read it in my bunk and lay there for a while looking at the ceiling of my quarters and thinking about 42 million people in 17 systems who did not yet know that something had changed. Provisional, not final. The process was not fast and would not be fast. The formal hearing was scheduled for 3 months out at the conclave station. There would be further challenges and legal architecture that I was not equipped to navigate, and that would require people with expertise I did not have. But the submission was in. The timestamp was fixed. The signal was on the record, in the conclave secretariat's archive and in the maintenance log of vaethari station, Drift Corridor 11, where it had been bleeding quietly into the harmonic return feed for somewhere between 8 and 12 years, patient and precise, speaking in the 41-second rhythm of a bloodline the Empire had declared extinct and was not. The record now said something different than it had said a week ago. The record now said what was actually true. That was the work. That was what the work had always been. The night after the provisional restoration came through, I was in the maintenance bay running the 217 check on the harmonic return feed. The signal was still there. It would be there as long as Soverath was on the station, and she was still on the station, working her 600 to 1800 data calibration shift the same as she had been working it for 3 years. The feed read, variance elevated, narrow band, lower spectrum, 41-second repeat, exact. I heard the door open behind me. I did not turn immediately. I was in the middle of the check. She sat down in the second chair, the one not usually occupied during the night shift, because there was ordinarily no one there but me, and she waited. She had a habit of waiting without impatience, not the waiting of someone who is idle, the waiting of someone who understands that a thing in process should be allowed to complete. When I had finished the check and logged it, I turned around. She looked like herself. That sounds like nothing, but it was not nothing. She had looked like herself for 6 days, since the day she had said her name in the maintenance bay while we were going over the submission documentation, and had not immediately looked around to check who might have overheard. Like herself. Not dramatic about it, not loud about it, that was not who she was. But carrying herself with the quality that had been absent, in some way I had not been able to name until its absence ended, for as long as I had known her. The quality of someone who is not running. The conclave secretariat sent a second notification, she said. The hearing is scheduled for 3 months from now. Good, I said. My legal standing will be provisional until the hearing, she said. The Bureau will contest it. I know, I said. The hearing will require an independent witness testimony, she said, in person. I'll request the leave, I said. Davis Rel owes me 4 months of accumulated rotation days. I have never taken any of it. She looked at me. The maintenance bay's overhead lights hummed. Through the porthole, the corridor's running lights painted the dark in their slow cycle, and the stars in Drift Corridor 11 held their positions with the patient constancy of things that have been in the same place for a long time, and will continue to be there long after the questions currently pending before the Outer Drift Conclave are resolved one way or another. You're very calm about this, she said. I found a signal, I said. I read it, the rest is process. A pause, then. Most people, when they found it, they would have escalated immediately. It would have been, she considered, the correct procedure. It would have been the procedure, I said. She looked at me for a moment with the expression I still did not have a word for. Then, Aldrich. I waited. I said my name, she said quietly. In the bay, I said it, and I did not think about it first, and I did not look around afterward. She looked at me directly. I have been careful for 11 years not to say it where anyone might hear. I said it, and I didn't catch myself in time to stop, and then I noticed I hadn't tried to stop. A pause. That was the first time that has happened. I thought about what to say to that. I said, you should have been able to say it every day. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the corridor held its dark. The harmonic feed cycled, 41 seconds, always 41 seconds. Yes, she said at last simply, I should have. The signal was in the maintenance feed. It had been there all along, bleeding through the shielding into the return feed in its patient, exact rhythm, real and true, speaking every 41 seconds into a silence that had been reading it as nothing. I had read it correctly. That was the work. That was what 11 years of learning to read the patterns in the noise behind the noise had been for, even when I had not known what it was for. That was enough.